Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 672 of People Behind the Science. Today, we are excited to be resharing our conversation with our guest, Dr. Naomi Tague, originally released on April 10th of 2015. Listeners, Naomi is an ecohydrologist who uses advanced data science techniques to study how water, plants, geology, and climate all interact, as well as how these systems are impacted by changes in land use and changes in climate. And in our conversation, she shares more about her life outside the lab, her experiences in science, and also her research. So listeners, I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am excited to introduce you all to Dr. Naomi Tague. So thank you so much for joining us, Naomi. How are you today?
I'm great. Looking forward to this.
Well, we are thrilled to have you with us today. And I want to take a moment to introduce you to our listeners out there. So listeners, Naomi is an associate professor of ecohydrology in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She received her bachelor degree from the University of Waterloo in systems design engineering and her master's and PhD degrees in geography from the University of Toronto. She then completed postdoctoral research with the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. And Naomi spent 5 years as a member of the faculty at San Diego State University before moving to UC Santa Barbara. And listeners, Naomi is here with us today to share her experiences in life and science. So Naomi, we want to get to know you today, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So let's start off with our first question here. What do you like to do, Naomi, when you're not doing science?
Well, one of the things I love, I think if I could have made money as a dancer, I might have gone that direction.
Really?
Yeah.
What kind of dance?
Well, and a very particular type of dance. I do a form called shinui, which combines martial art and dance. And there's something about using dance and body and really intricate understanding of movement that it's kind of like nature. It seems really different from what I do as a scientist, but I think there's a link there.
Absolutely. Well, that is very cool. I've never heard of Shinui. I'm going to have to watch some videos after this.
You are. And I'll say one other thing. I'm a Jew. And so I also spend a fair bit of time listening to, cool rabbis.
Very, very cool. Well, Naomi, great to get a little picture of what you do outside of science, a little snapshot of your life. And I love to chat with listeners about some of their hobbies that they have outside. And dancing, I think, is a fantastic way to relieve the stress of work sometimes. So do you spend a lot of your time dancing on the evenings? Are you in a group or anything?
Yeah. And, it is using a different part of your brain. So it really does help. It helps with creativity, right? It's like helps you think outside the box just to get away from a particular way of using your mind.
Absolutely. Well, fantastic way to expand your brain a little bit in different directions from where your science is taking you. But we're going to talk next about your scientific side. So can you tell us, Naomi, how do you describe what you do at work to someone who might not be familiar with your field?
So what I do is I look at how water and climate and vegetation, trees, grass, forests, your lawn, how they all interact. I really look at landscapes and really think about how they work, right? So that's why I'm an ecohydrologist. I look at if you can imagine water moving through a landscape, it's interacting with all kinds of things. And it's interacting with forests. And so I really think about how, for example, as snowpacks change when things get warmer, how does that affect the trees, which then affects the amount of water we have in streams? So I really take this integrated systems perspective. And I do that by building pretty complicated computer models of this, which help us give kind of a simulation laboratory for thinking about how things work.
Oh, very interesting. Well, you have a fascinating background here, Naomi, kind of bringing together this engineering, computer science, as well as the geography and hydrology aspects of it. So what really brought you to this place in this direction?
Well, I always love mathematics and computer modeling. I like the design aspect of building computer models. But, and I started out actually working in biomedical fields, working with MRIs and brain scans. And that was all interesting, but I felt like I was missing something. And it really was that I wanted to apply those skills to understanding nature. I just love nature. And that nature that you get when you go on a hike and you get a vista perspective, right? So I found a way to basically apply my love of math and computer science and that kind of design to thinking about how landscapes work. So I went from engineering into geography, which, because it studies space, gave me an opportunity really to apply those skills and learn all kinds of things about hydrology and carbon cycling and vegetation and, soil microbiology. But really it came oddly enough for me from, hey, where's a place that I can do something innovative with my love of computer design?
Naomi, wonderful to hear more about your science and a little bit about how you got there. But I also love to get little pieces of motivation from our guests on here. I know all of us can use motivation, and we've got a lovely Friday morning here and we're stuck at work. So can you share with us your favorite motivational quote or maybe a saying that you like to keep in your mind to keep you going?
It's funny, what motivates me seems to vary from time to time, right? So I can never come up with a favorite, but one thing I remember, I read this on a coffee shop wall somewhere, and it said that integrity is the integration of who you are with what you know.
Ah, I like that.
And I always love that because it comes back to, it's not just about what you know in science, it's also about who you are. I'm a Jew. It's part of my spiritual practice. It's not just science. It's really who you are and bringing that together with what you know. And so I always find that motivating to keep myself in the picture.
Absolutely. Well, I like that motivational quote. And I think a lot of us feel like our work is a big part of who we are and what we do is a big part of who we are. So I really like how that kind of ties it together. So can you tell us now a little bit about some of these people who you think have inspired you or maybe had a big impact on you during your career? Maybe people you'd consider role models.
I'm going to give an answer that it seems sort of classic and of course, but I still have to say it. My PhD advisor, Larry Band, and probably everyone somewhat feels that about their PhD advisor, but I still work with him even after all these years. And I think it's, not just what I learned from him, but his style. He always had this integrated picture. He knew what was going on in the field of hydrology and computer science, but also in economics. He had this real balance of both breadth and depth of understanding. And the other thing that, I always come back to, working with him, it wasn't always about getting the next big publication out. Half the time we never talked about publications. We were really interested in the ideas. And of course, as a scientist, you need to publish, you need to get your work out. That's part of what we do. Of course, that's true. But there was something about Larry where he was just excited about the ideas and moving the ideas forward. And I always come back to that. And I really appreciate what I learned from him in that way.
Great to hear about some of these wonderful inspirational pieces that Larry was able to impart on you during your time spent with him. And I like to hear this ability to continue working with people over the course of the years. And I think that's one of the great things in science is it is very collaborative. So you can maintain those relationships that you're forming with your PhD advisor, your postdoc advisor, people that you're able to meet and work with over the years, which I think is fantastic. So can you take us back to the very beginning, Naomi? You gave us a little snippet about how you got interested in your particular field, but can you tell us what got you excited about science and maybe math and engineering in the first place? What is one of these earliest memories that you have about being excited about it?
It's a funny way to say this, but if you go to a Japanese garden, right? Mm-hmm. A Japanese garden is so like nature, but it's not nature, right? It's totally fake.
It's too manicured, nature, yeah.
Right? But that's what makes it so beautiful. And believe it or not, somehow describing nature with math and computer models is almost I don't really mean this, but it's almost better than nature in the same way that a Japanese garden is sort of elevates nature. And so partly for me, finding these ways to describe things with mathematics really gives you an insight into how things work. It gives you a way of seeing the world that's different. And I'm excited by that. I like finding new ways of seeing things. So when I'm modeling the way water moves through the landscape, you never see that when you look up in a mountain, there's so much going on. Water is moving through that hill slope all the time. It's moving up through the roots of trees. It's interacting with the atmosphere. But if we don't find a way to model that, you never see it. And so it's a way of making visible what is really important, but basically invisible most of the time.
Well, this is a fantastic description of really what attracted you. And I really like how you're describing almost being able to see nature at its best and maybe most perfect. And I think a lot of us out there can relate to this idea of being attracted to places like these Japanese gardens or just manicured botanical gardens and golf courses and things like that. It's sort of the beauty of nature at its most perfect, which is just a phenomenal description. So can you tell us, now that you're in this field and you're able to integrate all these different areas, what is one project that you are working on right now that you are just the most excited to be a part of?
So, we were talking earlier about this idea of collaboration. And because what I do is really bring together these different systems and I develop these models, what I do is very collaborative, right? So I work with the field scientists, the people that go out and measure streams, that measure sap flow in trees, that measure leaf carbon content, that measure soil microbiology. And I integrate their findings into my model. So much of what I do is partly computer science, but it's also very collaborative with working with these field scientists. So I'm part of this big project now called Critical Zone Observatories, and we have one in the Sierras, where we're really trying to understand how, as things get warmer and snowpacks melt earlier, what happens to the whole water cycle? In all kinds of ways. Do trees become more water stressed? At what point do sequoias change the way they use water? And then again, how does that affect stream flow? Do plants use more water, less water? What if we manage forests differently? What if we thin a forest? What happens? And it's a really fun project because I'm working with the people who are on the ground, measuring snow and looking at how snow is changing. I'm working with field scientists who are measuring how trees are changing. And so I get to really link with on-the-ground field information and pull it into my model to really answer these questions that are important for society. How vulnerable are our water resources? How are our forests changing? And is there anything we can do about it?
Certainly. So do you spend most of your days in your office or in your lab at the computer working on models, or do you get to sort of tromp around a little bit in the field?
Occasionally they let me away from the computer and go out and talk around the field. And that's the beauty of doing all this collaboration with field scientists is, they always want me to come out and see their field site. And the other thing about the kind of modeling work I do, sometimes it's really helpful because it gives you a landscape scale picture for actually figuring out where we should put our field sites, because field work is expensive. It's really expensive to put in stream gauges and flux towers. So, sometimes we kind of take my model and we go marching out in the field to figure out where we should put some instrument in.
Very, very cool. Well, great to hear that you get some of this experience out in the field to sort of complement what you're doing in the lab and really get that real life big picture view of it. So fantastic.
I do.
I like that. Now, we've talked about a lot of exciting things about your career and a lot of the high points, but we haven't yet talked about some of the challenges. And I know there are a lot of different kinds of challenges in science, and some of them come from these collaborations that you're trying to do or trying to bring together field work with some of the more theoretical modeling type work. And some of them are just these big challenges that you face as you're going through the career path of a scientist. So, Naomi, can you think about all these different kinds of challenges that you've had over the course of your career? And can you tell us about one of these moments of struggle or one of these moments of failure? Because I think a lot of our listeners out there might be in a position where they're somewhere early on in their career or they're thinking about a career in science and they're kind of wondering what to do in these difficult situations. So can you tell us about one and how you got through it?
So this happens to everybody. Sometimes papers get rejected. And sometimes even papers, you submit them for publication and you get a review back from some paper that you worked on really hard and you think is really good, and you get some negative review. And it's always discouraging and it's hard to not feel bad about yourself. And I've found that what I've learned in those moments is you have to sort of step away from it. And this is where friends really help. Mm-hmm. In those moments, it's not to just get lost in, oh my gosh, I can't believe this paper got rejected or this proposal got rejected, but to, spend the evening out with some friends, even if you're not talking about how bad you feel, just realizing that this paper isn't everything, that a science career is a big perspective thing. And one paper, one proposal doesn't make or break you ever. But also to always have that context that you're more than your work, right? That you're the people that you work with, they're your friends. And so it's always having a people around you to help you maintain a bigger perspective on what you're doing, I think really helps in those times, which we all have, where a paper gets rejected, right? Or something doesn't work out the way you want it to work. The other thing about science is, really good science, it's hard. And sometimes you fail. If you're never failing, you're really not doing anything that innovative. So you kind of got to get used to failure. It's hard. It's just hard.
Absolutely. So what helped you? I know it's a challenge for a lot of scientists as they're going through the process. You're the one who's doing great in school in a lot of cases. You're used to being successful. Maybe you hit grad school, maybe you hit your postdoc years, and you start getting these failures. So what are some things that really helped you adjust and adapt and maybe become more comfortable with it?
I really do think it helps to talk about it. It really helps to, have collaborators, have other people, walk into whoever office is next to you that hopefully you're friends with and say, oh my gosh, my paper just got rejected and they said this horrible thing. And just to actually not keep it to yourself really helps. And do that first. Then when you've kind of calmed down, go back. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten a paper and I think the comments are so negative and I feel really bad. I step away from it, I come back, I read the comments again, and they really aren't that bad.
Yeah.
And so I think doing that, just having people that you can go to kind of deal with the whole emotional trauma of rejection.
Almost vent a little, yeah.
Come back to it. And usually you can fix things, right? Realizing that it is a process of revision and not taking critique personally and realizing it's just part of the process.
Absolutely. So is this something that you have to guide your students through? I know a lot of faculty members get to mentor students at different stages in their career. So is this something where you tell your students this advice to get them through their first failures?
Oh, you do all the time, right? You tell them that. It's so funny. Pretty much every PhD student I have, you send a paper out and you get a bunch of reviews back. And sometimes I'll read them and I'm like, oh, those are pretty positive. And the student will be like, oh my gosh, I thought this was negative. And I'm like, no, that's what the review process is. So I think it really helps to go through a review process with your advisor and talk through the reviews with your students so they learn to interpret things in a more positive light.
Naomi, I think you brought up some really important points and some constructive advice for people who might be going through this situation, which is all too common in science, where you're getting rejections. And I think, like you said, you can't take it personally. You have to separate yourself from your work in some of these cases, get away from it for a little while, and then approach it and try and view it as constructive criticism. So fantastic pieces of advice to share with us. And now we don't just want to talk about the struggles and the tough times in science. There are so many exciting aspects of the career. So can you share with us one of your own success stories? And it can be a huge success or even just one of these smaller occurrences along the way.
I guess I'd say one that's more diffuse, really, is just that the modeling work that I've done, so many people are interested in using it. In fact, something that I struggle with is how to have the resources to be involved in the number of projects that I get asked to be involved in. So that makes me happy because I feel like I've created something that's useful for people, and that always feels good. Kind of more theoretically, I have this great story. I was at some meeting and I, went out for a beer with a colleague and we started talking about how no one's really thinking about the way geology affects how sensitive water systems are to climate change. Everyone's thinking about how earlier snowpacks affect streams, but no one is really thinking about this from a geologic context, how the different rock types and the different soils can really play a role in determining how different watersheds work. And I think I've been really successful since that conversation over a beer at getting papers out that really demonstrate how important geology is. And I noticed that recently everyone's talking about this topic. And I'm like, I've been thinking about this for 5 or 6 years. So that's one of the things I feel really proud about.
Congratulations on being a leader in the field, taking it in that direction. And I think you're absolutely right. A lot of these sort of off the cuff comments and conversations can take you to really interesting directions in your research. So great point to bring up. And you mentioned also that you've been getting a lot of different project opportunities and things kind of coming your way. And I know a lot of scientists are bad at saying no. So what are some strategies that you use to kind of pick and choose which things you'll take on and which things you'll have to turn down for now?
So the big one is if you're going to work with people you enjoy working with. Life is too short to work with people that you don't enjoy working with. And it makes the work better. You have to work with people that, you're going to have fun talking about the project and dealing with the million, difficult things that come up, right? Whether there's some bug in the code or the field instrument broke. You have to have people that you enjoy working with. I think it's really important. And then sometimes you need a couple of what I call bread and butter projects that aren't that interesting, but they bring in some funding resources for a PhD student. You need a couple of those just to sometimes maintain funding for your research. But you've always got to make sure that you have some room for some projects that you're really interested in, that are more innovative, right? If you get kind of caught up so that everything you're doing is kind of repeating what you're good at, I think you get bored. And so you have to have a couple of those usually, but at some point you can say no to those and focus on some more challenging, higher risk ideas.
Definitely. Well, I think those are both great strategies to use. Definitely focus on the people you're going to work with and trying to diversify, have a variety of projects. Some of them are more sure things, maybe easier to get funded, and some of them are just very interesting and exciting that you are heavily invested in. So I think this applies not only to science, but to a lot of other endeavors if people are faced with a variety of different opportunities coming their way and trying to decide which ones make the most sense to take. So thanks for sharing that with us today. And now we talked a little bit about what you like to do in your free time. You mentioned you're quite the dancer and you have some other hobbies as well. I know a lot of scientists are avid readers, and I have just gotten some phenomenal book recommendations. My list is ever growing. So can you share with us today, Naomi, a book that you've read and really enjoyed that you think all of us should check out?
Oh, I know. A book I read recently that I really liked. It was called The Functional Art. And it was a book actually about visualizing information by this Italian designer type writer. And I mean, even if you're not someone who does data visualization, it's just a fun book to read because it really gives you a sense of, it's partly human psychology, right? How you think about things, how, different pictures give you different ideas, different graphs, different ways of visualizing information, how that really changes how you think about things. And it's just a fun book. It was well written. I really enjoyed it.
Well, wonderful recommendation. We will put that out on our website for our listeners to check out if they are looking for their next good read. And I love just getting all these book recommendations from people, seeing what's on people's bookshelves. And oftentimes I'm so fascinated by the book, I have to go pick it up myself. So great recommendation. Now, we talked about some of your opportunities to go out in the field for your research. And I know scientists in general tend to do quite a bit of traveling, whether it's for field work or conferences or other opportunities. So Naomi, can you think back on all the places that you've been for science, and can you take us on a little mini vacation here and tell us where you were and what was it about this place that made it so memorable?
Well, I'll tell you about one, although I can't tell you where it is because I'm sworn to secrecy.
Ah, I'm intrigued.
But I was somewhere and it was, in the mountains, in the forest, and there was this river and we wanted to find the source of the river, right? We wanted to sort of find where the river started. And we're hydrologists, we kind of know how rivers work. We know how to do this, but, it was dense forest. It was hiking up this, and it was a river with a fair amount of water in it. But we went up sort of higher elevation and there was nothing. And it didn't make sense to us because you can't just get that much water sort of out of nowhere.
Right, it has to come from somewhere. Yeah.
It has to come from somewhere, right? And so we kept hiking. We found this Forest Service person. We eventually found the source of this. And I tell you, it was a spring, but not a tiny little, half-meter spring. But it was like a waterfall coming out of a rock wall. Imagine a waterfall, but above the waterfall, there's just trees. And then there's this moss-covered rocky waterfall with just water gushing out of it. It was sort of the size of a waterfall, but water just gushing out of nowhere. It was this underground spring, and it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And the guy who helped us find it said, there is a path to it, but we don't put it on maps because we don't want people to know where it is. So I'm sworn to say it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen.
Well, that is phenomenal. So can you give us any hints in terms of what country, state, area it's located in?
Well, it was thick conifer forests and lots of water. So if you're a good biogeographer, that would help.
Well, listeners, we have a mystery at our hands here. So Naomi, what brought you to this place? Was this for research, collecting data in the field?
It was part of this looking at the effect of geology on stream flow.
Very, very cool. So have you been back since this original discovery?
I haven't, which is really bad. It's on my I need to get back there list.
Gotcha. If you can find it again, because it's not on the maps, right?
No, I'm not sure I can, too. It's really true. It's a good point.
Well, Naomi, fantastic description of this sort of magical almost place with a waterfall just erupting out of a big rock, it sounds like. So very, very cool. And I know scientists get to go to some of these phenomenal places, and it's almost one of the perks of the career that a lot of people don't realize or don't know about. And one of the things that we like to talk about as well are some of the opportunities that you get to work with phenomenal people. And you hinted at this earlier when you mentioned that when you're choosing projects and deciding what you want to do, you want to think about the people you're going to work with. And I know a lot of the labs that you work in over the course of the years, they have some interesting personalities that go along with them. And it often translates to some fun traditions that spring up or even just funny memories you share because you're serious about your science, but you like to have fun too. So can you tell us, Naomi, about one of these traditions or even just a funny science memory that you have?
It's really true. I really enjoy my lab group. And it's nice now when we go to our annual American Geophysical Union meeting, all the people that used to be in my lab get together for a beer one night. And it's fun for like the new students to meet the people who have now gone on from my lab and have professions. But, it's funny. My lab space at the university that I work at, I share with a more senior colleague. He doesn't have as many students at the moment, so I needed more space, so I kind of took this space over. You'll find as an academic, real estate is very important, right?
You're often sneaking in overnight and moving in, right?
But there was this back part of the lab, and they had been field snow researchers. I won't mention any names, and they piled all kinds of stuff back there. I kept saying, can you guys get rid of some of that stuff so we need more desk space? And they're like, no, it's really, really important. And then just 2 weeks ago, I had a new student come in and I really needed desk space. I said, look, can I clean this out? And they said, okay, yeah, just store it somewhere. This very important stuff. And I'm going through it. And it's field notes from like decades ago. And then I find this shopping list for stuff for some field excursion, and it's dated 1986.
Oh my gosh.
I'm laughing at like, these are these really important papers. And anyway, it was very funny. The way people hang this stuff in these labs. So, and you got to carve out your real estate. It's very important.
Absolutely. Well, this is hilarious. And I think a lot of scientists out there who might be listening who have labs of their own, or even people who are sort of thinking about your own basement, the things that accumulate there that, of course, it's all very precious. You can't get rid of it. But well, Naomi, are you then making a conscious effort not to accumulate clutter in your own lab?
Yes, I am. But, we're computer modelers. So, other than old computers, we don't create as much stuff.
Gotcha. Understandable. So how big is your lab? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
So I have about 5 PhD students or so, more or less, in my lab. But then, as I've said, the work I do is very collaborative. So I work with field scientists in other labs. And so oddly enough, I'm on the committee of, I think, at least 5 PhD students now who are not at UCSB, just because as part of their research, they're doing something with their advisor that maybe involves field work or involves a particular type of analysis, but they want to integrate it with the modeling. And so I end up being on their committee. So they often come and spend, 6 months in my lab. So what's kind of fun is that there's sort of a core group, but then there's always people coming in and spending, 5 or 6 months there, right?
Gotcha.
So that makes it very dynamic, and I like that.
Certainly. It's fun to have visitors in the lab.
Yes, we always do. That we're never without at least one visitor.
Very cool. Well, Naomi, it sounds like you have a wonderful lab there, and great to hear a little bit more about some of these funny memories. And I think you did bring up a good point there in terms of the struggle for space. I think in a lot of cases, different labs are always expanding. I think universities are expanding, and it always seems like there is a struggle to find enough place to A, put your stuff, and B, put your students. So
yes,
great point there. And now one thing that I love to chat with scientists about, and this is one of my favorite questions in the interview, is sort of about the big what ifs in science. So we talked a little bit about your research today and some of the stuff that you're working on now, but we haven't talked about some of these big questions that are burning in your own mind. So can you think, Naomi, about these big questions and tell us if things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility, all these constraints in science, were not an issue? What is the question that you are dying to know the answer to?
Well, I'm going to, if I may, rephrase it and say, and this will show how much an engineer I am rather than a scientist. I mean, there are some really interesting questions, I think. But for me, it's more, if I wasn't resource constrained, I feel like this kind of modeling work that I do, right, where we can take the results from so many field scientists out there doing really interesting things. I work with some people that are looking at post-fire effects on nitrogen cycling, and they go in there with this really innovative instruments and figure out, something about how these microbes work. But then that kind of just tells you something about this one little plot. How do we put that into a landscape context? I guess you could phrase that as a question about what if we put a bunch of different findings from all these different field experiments and theoretical models and stuff that people are doing, how do we put that together to give us a more integrated picture? And I feel like we're on the verge of being able to do that, but not quite. I think the way we sort of do science makes it hard to do that. And like I said, I get more requests for collaborations now than I can do. And I think, if I had a team of computer scientists, right, who could help with the data visualization, who could help assimilate data that we get from remote sensing, that we get from these field experiments, I think we could create, I sort of call them tools, but you could think of models as ways to integrate and archive and put together what we're finding from all of this really great research that's being done all over the place. How do we put that together? So I envision doing science in a slightly different way. That what I would love is to have this center where someone up in Colorado or up in the Alps, is working on snow, and they've figured out the way in which dust affects how snow melts. But they want to know, well, what's the implications of that for stream flow? But they just know something about snow. And it would be great if they could just call me up and talk to my team. And it really would take a team to do this and say, hey, can you put this in your model and tell me what the implications of this might be for stream flow? I would love to be able to do that. But that would really take doing something in a more team-oriented way, right? One person can't do that. One PhD student can't do that. And I think we're on the verge of that. But I'd like to see sort of a better use and evolutioning, doing really creative things with informatics as a way to get more out of the science that we're doing.
Absolutely. Well, Naomi, I think you brought up some really exciting possibilities and just some brilliant directions that science needs to go. And I think this applies not only to your specific field, but really across the fields of science, right? I think every scientific question can be approached at a wide variety of different levels. So being able to integrate information from all those different levels, from all those different pieces that are fitting together to get a better view of the big picture, I think is such a great initiative. So you mentioned we're getting close, but we're not quite there yet. How do you think we're getting closer? What steps are we taking to move in that direction?
Well, you can think about this critical zone observatory that I've talked about. So certainly in the US, the National Science Foundation has been trying to think about funding these observatories that bring together lots of different scientists. So I think that's a good move in the right direction. I think some of the new technologies, new remote sensing data, new computer science technologies will really help us to be able to do this, right? I think partly what's missing is the sense that part of it is building the right team. I think we still kind of underestimate how it's not just software and instrumentation and individual research projects, but really thinking about how you put this stuff together. But I think everybody knows we have to move in that direction. So I think there are some new innovations that are helping us get there.
Certainly. And I think definitely bringing up this technological component of it from an almost IT perspective of being able to move the data to one place, store it, house it, build these databases. These are a lot of things that scientists don't necessarily think about. Maybe when you're starting up your lab, you're sort of focusing on the little research questions that you're trying to answer, but not really thinking about what is the infrastructure almost that you would need in place to be able to handle getting all these pieces and putting them together. So very, very interesting.
Although what you're saying is very true, I am talking about something a little different. Those are the sort of baseline data infrastructure, right? And I think we're getting pretty good at that. But there's still this knowledge infrastructure, which is a little bit different. It's the tools that help you translate your idea so that you link, let's say, what I'm learning about snow with what Mary over here is learning about the way trees use water, right? So it's also putting ideas together. And computer scientists can give us the databases, right? But it takes a combination of a really close working relationship between someone who's computer modeling savvy and the scientist to be able to design tools that help us with understanding.
Well, very, very cool and exciting to hear that your group is really playing a big role in this with some of the collaborations that you're doing and being able to connect the dots sort of between these different ideas and put them together into something really more holistic. And Naomi, I know over the course of your career as a scientist, you have been exposed to some brilliant people and you've gotten some great advice. So can you think now on all these different pieces of advice that have been shared with you from all the different sources? And can you share with us today what you would consider the best piece of advice that all of us listening here today should follow?
I would say really don't take things personally. If you email someone and they don't email you back, just assume it's because they're busy. If you go to some meeting and someone doesn't ask you a question or doesn't talk to you, don't ever take it personally. I see that happen to people and they feel insulted or they feel slighted, and it actually gets in the way of collaborating. Or when you get that review, it's really important to understand that everyone's busy and people have all kinds of different things going on. And so not taking things personally, whether it's in a faculty meeting, whether it's an academic meeting, whether it's in an email exchange, I think really helps you.
Fantastic advice. And I think you're absolutely right. There are so many times in science where people are just swamped. You've got grant deadlines, you're worried about papers, things like that. You don't always, take a look around and think about some of these interactions that you're having with people on a daily basis. And I think sometimes it does help to stop and think, okay, I should say hi to my graduate students as I walk in. But, in a lot of cases, the person on the receiving end does need to sort of take a step back and not take it personally and sort of put it into the context of the big picture of life is crazy in science sometimes.
Yes, but it's true. You should also, as much as you can, say thank you.
Absolutely.
With students when you can, and good morning.
Well, Naomi, fantastic advice for our listeners. Is there any other last piece of advice or maybe one last piece of inspiration that you would like to end our interview on today?
I'm not sure, but I think everyone would say this, but you have to keep making it fun. You have to keep finding the places in what you're doing. Of course, there's some days where I'm like, it's another committee meeting. I can't take it. I'm going to go back to waitressing. I have those days. We all do, right? But you really have to spend time where you stop the busyness and you just sit and think about the ideas. It's really important to find the moments where you get to do that, right? So that you keep hey, I'm doing this because I really love it.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a really important point as well. You sort of get caught up oftentimes in the day-to-day, the things that need to get done, the meetings, the administrative tasks, and you do need to take that time to really reflect on how excited you are about these projects in the lab and the science that you're doing and the really big efforts that you're able to contribute to. So wonderful advice and piece of inspiration there. Can you tell our listeners now how they can reach out to learn a little bit more about what you're working on and more about you?
So we have a blog. It's ecohydrolab.com, ecohydrolab.com. And so we have a blog there, and that also has contact information and can give you a sense of what we're up to.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, check out Naomi's Labs blog and definitely ask any questions if anything comes up. And Naomi, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a little bit about your work and your story.
Thanks. I really enjoyed our conversation.
This was a lot of fun for me as well. And thank you to our listeners out there. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.